Welcome to the Christian Life Bible College series, The Bible in Statues and Stones, Session 2. Today we're going to go to the land of ancient Egypt, the land of the pharaohs. We'll see how Egypt was in the time of the patriarchs, Jacob and Joseph. During that time, chariots clattered through the city streets. Horsemen were seen, and a people from the east, Semites from the desert, walked into the land which was in disarray because of the weakness of the pharaohs. And so a particular Semitic dynasty came to the Egyptian throne. It was at that time that Joseph was promoted to be number 2, so to speak, in the land. And we'll have a look at what archaeology says about the time of Joseph and the background to the biblical narrative. Then we'll turn our attention to Amenhotep IV, one of those Hyksos pharaohs, who worshipped one god, unlike the other pharaohs who had worshipped a multiplicity of deities in what was in fact a very complex Egyptian cult. We'll follow Moses and the people on the Exodus through the desert, and then join Joshua as the Israelis posed to enter the promised land. At that period, the Amarna letters from Tel El Amarna speak of the conditions of the land as Joshua was poised to invade. 14th century letters that are the correspondence of a local ruler to the pharaoh, pleading for help in the face of what are called the Hapiru, desert wanderers, some of whom were of course the people of Israel. We'll then move on and have a look at those peoples whom Joshua encountered, the Philistines, the Arameans, the Hittites, and others. Finally, we'll have a look at Israel as an empire in the period of King David. So this week is about the formation of the Israelite nation and how it is illustrated in the stones and statues of the British Museum and in other archaeological artefacts that have been discovered in the Holy Land that are now in other parts of the world in other museums. Those of us who are members of the Board of Christian Life Bible College, its trustees and governors, and members of its faculty staff, would like to wish you well as you begin this study. We hope you will thoroughly enjoy the material of this video. The Lord bless you as you undertake your work for Him and your study.
Here's a map of what the historian Breasted called the Fertile Crescent, and the rivers of Mesopotamia, Tigris coming right up and over to the west, and then down the Jordan Valley, across the Sinai Desert to Egypt and the River Nile. The Nile is Egypt, and it's a fascinating country because pressed in by the desert, the Egyptians were faced with death. That tight, narrow strip of fertile land, and just a mile or so beyond it, the awful desert. And beyond the desert, awful people. And they looked upon the desert as part of the chaos that surrounded them, and the people of foreign nations as barbarians and some of the part of the chaos that must be kept out of Egypt. Joseph was sold down into Egypt. The religion of Egypt was totally devoted to the afterlife. This is a prehistoric burial, and the gentleman's known to the staff at the British Museum as Ginger, but reflects an ancient belief, prehistoric belief in the afterlife. The corpse has been placed in a fetal position, symbolising a birth or new birth into the next world, and the grave objects, the pottery and other objects, were for the use of the person in the next life. I think it's very sad and quite wrong that this chap should be there, and as I look at it, I wonder if he had a sense of humour, whether he got on well with his wife, whether he loved his children. I think he ought to be taken back to Egypt and respectfully interred. but it is an example of the Egyptian fixation with the afterlife. If you've ever tried to unravel Egyptian religion and given up, don't worry. One Egyptologist named Gardner has described it as chaotic polytheism. There were three main strands. The first and oldest was that each community had its own god, usually an animal, an owl, a hawk, a crocodile, or a goose. The next strand was the goodies and baddies, which reflected the conflict between Upper and Lower Egypt. They were two separate countries. We would call them Ethiopia and Egypt. And they were at war for many, many years, but eventually they were united. And that period of conflict was reflected in the religion, fighting between goodness and badness. And the third aspect of religion was fertility, the rising of the Nile and the crops coming again. It was complicated by foreign gods being brought in, and also complicated by the fact that whenever the ruling family changed and a new dynasty came to the throne, the new dynasty brought their god, which would be different from the old one, and he took over all the myths, and everything was placed on the new god. This is the god Amun-Re, who originally was a goose. All that's left to him of his gooseness is the two feathers springing out of his head. And when you prayed to Amun-Re for help, you worshipped him, you addressed him, "O great cackler," in respect of his gooseness. There were many different sun gods, for instance. This was the bull Apis, who carried the sun across the sky between his horns, and might well have been the prototype of the golden calf in the wilderness, made from the earrings of the ladies by Aaron. This is the scarab beetle, which was another form of the sun god, very popular. The scarab beetle is the dung beetle, and its life cycle, very interesting. It used to get a ball of dung, mould it into a sphere, and insert its eggs inside the ball of dung. It drew the ball of dung everywhere it went, rolled it everywhere it went, and one day, lo and behold, out of the ball of dung came baby beetles. And the Egyptians saw this as a symbol of the sun going across the sky and giving life. Yet another sun god was the sky goddess Nut, who was supported by the air god standing on the earth god. And she gave birth to the sun every morning. These are from Egyptian tombs and illustrate the story of Joseph. You remember how when Joseph was in prison, the butler and the baker had their dreams. On the left is a lady delivering loaves from the bakers, carrying the bread on her head, just like the baker did in the story of Joseph's imprisonment. This is a wall painting from a tomb showing the harvest scene, and very interesting to us. At the bottom, the corn is being reaped, but in the top pictures, the corn is being measured. Labourers are filling boxes with the corn, and scribes are noting down exactly how much corn has been harvested. Now, this makes it immediately clear that the story of Joseph storing up the grain from the 7 good years, well within the context of the culture. It was quite the ordinary thing to do, to reap the grain, to measure it, and to know exactly how much they had. Round about the time of Abraham, just after, Egypt fell into 100 years of chaos. Pharaoh after Pharaoh came to the throne, several of them only reigned for 2 days or 3 days, and the local lords were fighting each other. Egypt was in a state of chaos, and into that situation, Canaanites came down and secured the throne. They moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes, 300 or 400 miles up the Nile, right back up to the delta. Be handy for the relatives to come down and stay for the weekend. And so when Joseph came down into Egypt, he was first of all quite close to Pharaoh's court in the delta, and also the new kings, known as the Hyksos, the foreign kings, had only just established themselves in Egypt, and so Joseph and the patriarchs, with their Canaanite culture, would have been warmly accepted and welcomed into Egypt. This is a wall painting showing Semites from Canaan paying tribute to Pharaoh. And this is exactly how Joseph's brothers would have looked as they came down into Egypt during the famine to beg Joseph to give them some corn. For some strange reason, the artists and Hollywood always show people in Bible times dressed as modern Arabs. Quite arbitrary, no reason why they should be dressed like modern Arabs. This is far more likely how Abraham, Jacob, Joseph and his brothers would have been dressed. And this very reminiscent of the brothers kneeling before Joseph, and someone's even suggested that the little slave in the picture was Benjamin. But you can see how clearly the artist has depicted the Semite features. The story of Genesis ends with Joseph dying and being buried in a coffin in Egypt. And this is a rather special coffin plated with gold. Whether Joseph was buried in one like that, we don't know. But we do know that at the Exodus, the coffin was taken out of Egypt back to the Promised Land. During the time that the Israelites were in Egypt, the Book of the Dead evolved. The Egyptians were neurotic about the afterlife, and the priests found it very profitable. They told people stories about terrible things in the next world, demons and monsters that must be outwitted and avoided. And so on the sides of a rich man's coffin would be written instructions on how to survive all the dangers of the next world. People felt this so important, they were ready to pay quite large sums of money. And the priests were quite ready to make it more and more complicated, so they got in more and more money. And soon there was too much to write on the sides of the coffin, so a Book of the Dead was evolved. This is a copy of the Book of the Dead, and chapter 25, the most important, the judgment scene. And here, a scribe, Annie, on the left, is facing the judgment. The jackal god, Anubis, is weighing his heart in a scale, and his heart is in the left-hand scale in a jar. In the right-hand scale, there is a feather, which was the hieroglyph for truth. And so Annie's heart is being weighed against truth. At the top is a jury of lesser gods, and they would question Annie on his everyday life. Don't know exactly, but one of them would probably say, "Have you been absolutely honest in all your business dealings?" And he would reply, "I have sinned not against God or man." Next one would say, "Did you cheat on your wife?" "I have sinned not against God or man." And so on through the things of everyday life. If he was telling the truth, okay. But if it was a little bit of a whopper, the scale would crash down and his heart would be gobbled up by the crocodile-jawed, eagle-footed, hippopotamus-torsoed, leopard-chested monster that would then devour him. This was a kind of indulgence, just like medieval indulgence. You paid an enormous sum of money and your name was written in the Book of the Dead. The ordinary people, the priest would just take one off the shelf and write your name in the blank spaces. A rich man like this scribe Annie would have one custom made. But if you had a Book of the Dead, you were not guilty of any sin, and you could write over your tomb, justified. But in the cemeteries, they found scarab ornaments, and on the base inscribed, "O my heart, rise not up against me and condemn me." And so, although they paid an enormous sum to write justified over their tomb, they didn't feel justified in their hearts. Very interesting that in the East, the Mesopotamian countries were ultimate materialists. No atrocity was too terrible for them to commit to get their hands on some plunder, and they didn't care a bit about the afterlife. In the West, the Egyptians were neurotic about the afterlife. Between the two was Israel. And David wrote, "Happy is the man whose sins are forgiven." The Hebrew way of forgiveness, Leviticus 17:11, "The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you." The Israelite worshipper didn't in fact bring the sacrifice. The sacrifice was provided by the judge. "I have given it to you to make atonement for your souls." Leviticus 17:11, the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. God took the initiative. "I have given it to you." God so loved the world, He gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And in the Old Testament, "I have given it to you to make atonement for your souls." And so David was able to write, "Happy is the man whose sins are forgiven." Literally tons of Egyptian papyrus has been uncovered. The desert, the dryness of the desert has preserved the papyrus made from the papyrus reed, and many fascinating documents have been found written on the papyrus. This is an ancient Egyptian papyrus copy of wisdom literature, which is very close in many parts to our book of Proverbs, showing that some of the Proverbs were current throughout the Middle East. Don't know if you've been able to learn much of your ancient Egyptian, but certainly you've started, because the word paper is in fact the ancient Egyptian word for paper. And the Greeks stuck their masculine ending on it, making it papyrus. But the ancient Egyptian word paper has come down to us intact. The Hyksos were driven out, and the experience of driving the Hyksos out gave the Egyptian armies confidence, and they began to campaign and to build an empire. There came to the throne of Egypt one of the most amazing men in history. Came to the throne as Amenhotep or Amenhotes, renderings vary, the fourth. And he was a genius. He threw aside the ancient Egyptian religion and established his own. He believed in one God. The Egyptians had an enormous pantheon. His one God was not connected in any way with a visible object. His divinity was realized through the warmth of the sun. You can't see it, you can't hold it, you can't weigh it, You feel it and you know it's giving benefit, the warmth of the sun. And he pictured the sun as sending out rays, each one with a hand holding the symbol of life. The basic principle of his religion was truth. And he called himself many times Akhenaton, who is living in truth. He changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaton in honor of his god. He called his god Aton. Another revolutionary idea, he treated all races as equal. The Egyptians looked upon everybody else as barbarians. He treated all races as equal. And in his hymns, he said how the warmth of the sun nourished all the people of the earth. He refused to let people treat him as a god. Normally, the Pharaoh was worshipped as a god. And he said, just treat me as an ordinary man. I am your equal, and in death we will all be made equal. His truth came across in the art. He suffered from a physical ailment, thought to be a kind of endocrine deficiency, which gave him a disfigured face, an enormous stomach, long limbs, and something of a humped back. And on his portraits, he's shown exactly like that, with all his disfigurement. One amazing little relief shows him with his family and a baby on his lap. His wife there with the children, and there is the Pharaoh with a baby on his lap. Absolutely unthinkable that the mighty Pharaoh should be depicted as an ordinary person who enjoyed being with his family. But he lived in truth. Now then, this was when the Israelites were in Egypt. There is very little that we can say that points to the Israelites being in Egypt, very little evidence indeed. But here it seems he has caught the Israelite religion. Just take the prayer of Abraham in front of Sodom and Gomorrah. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And that sums up Akhenaton's religion. And I'm sure that he caught the Israelite religion from the Israelites in Egypt. Very little evidence of the Israelites being in Egypt, but a scarab beetle has been found, and it's inscribed in honor of a pharaoh named Jacob, Jacob or Jacob El. Some have suggested that perhaps one of the Israelites did come to the throne of Egypt, but certainly it shows how the Canaanites who came down as the Hyksos had that name in common with the patriarchs. Another suggestion, after the Hyksos were expelled, an amazing queen reigned for some while, Hatshepsut. As she reigned as pharaoh, and even wore an artificial pharaoh's beard to emphasize her authority. And in one of her inscriptions, she says how she cleared up the mess left by the Hyksos, the foreign kings, when they were driven out. She cleared up the mess, and she mentions the vagabonds who were in the midst of the Hyksos. And the word vagabond closely related to Hebrew, which apparently in its root means a wanderer or a vagabond. And it's possible that Hatshepsut, in her reference to the vagabonds that were in the midst of the Hyksos, is a reference to the Israelites. Akhenaton's concentration on his religion meant that he neglected the empire. He built his own capital city, which he called Akhetaton, the horizon of Aton. a beautiful city with new temples for his new religion. At his death, the new religion was overthrown and his city of Akhetaton fell into disuse and was covered with the sand. In the 1880s, an Egyptian lady was digging for fertilizer, and the old bricks, the old mud bricks of the ancient Akhetaton, which was now called Tel El Amarna, made excellent fertilizer. While she was digging, she came across some of these tablets. She dug up quite a lot of them and sold a sackful to a merchant for about 20 pence. He took them off to Cairo, and many of them were smashed on the way. They were shown to some of the scholars who dismissed them as crude forgeries. But Budge of the British Museum, he decided they were genuine and bought most of them, but some were owned by merchants who were under contract to Berlin. Most of them are in the British Museum, some are in the Berlin Museum. They're known as the Tel El Amarna tablets. They were the Foreign Office files of Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, became Akhenaton. And they were sent from all over the empire, from Nineveh, from Babylon, from the Hittite towns, from Jerusalem, from Lachish, from Hatzor, and they give a detailed insight into the life of the empire and the life of Palestine 100 years before Joshua entered it. Several interesting things about these tablets. First of all, they weren't written in hieroglyphs, but in cuneiform, and shows that cuneiform was, as it were, the lingua franca of the whole region, long before Egyptian control built the Egyptian empire. Secondly, each region developed its own style of writing, showing that each region had had its cuneiform for a long period of time. Now, in the book of Joshua, Joshua 15, we read that Joshua conquered a city called Debir, which before time was called Kiriath Sepher. Later on in the chapter, Debir is also described as Kiriath Sana. One of the terms, Kiriath Sepher, means the city of scribes. The other, Kiriath Sana, means the city of books. Or it may be the other way round, I'm not sure. But certainly it was a city where writing was the main industry. And probably all the nobles and the merchants of the area sent their sons to Debir to study reading, writing, so on. It was the Oxbridge of the area. The study of these tablets has been very valuable, and quite recently, the last couple of years, microscopic study of one of the tablets has established the site of an unknown city. One of the tablets was from a city that couldn't be identified. But microscopic study of the tablet showed a peculiar kind of clay that could only have come from one part of the world. And I think it was in Cyprus, I'm not sure. But anyway, from that microscopic study of the clay of the tablet, it was established, the site of this ancient, previously unknown city has been established. A young man came to the throne of Egypt, Ramesses II. He reigned for 67 years, longer than most kings reigned. He's been described as one of the vainest kings who ever lived. And throughout Egypt, he had statues of himself set up, big statues and small statues. More statues of Ramesses in Egypt than lampposts today in Cairo. He is almost certainly the pharaoh of the Exodus. In the back of this great colossal head of Ramesses, hieroglyphic inscriptions saying what a wonderful person he is. This is an ancient statue. It was ancient to Ramesses, probably of a pharaoh called Thutmose, but Ramesses vandalized it by having his name carved on the statue's shoulders. His son, Merneptah, had his name carved on the statue's breast. Now, Ramesses campaigned in Palestine, made no mention of the Israelites. His son, Merneptah, campaigned in Palestine, and on one of his temple inscriptions, he says how he conquered Israel. So between the carving of Ramesses on the shoulders and the carving of Merneptah on the breast of this statue, the Israelites came out of Egypt and into the promised land. This is a remarkable souvenir of the time of the Exodus. It's a sun-baked clay brick. It's stamped with the cartouche of Ramesses II, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. You remember how Moses went into Pharaoh and asked for 2 or 3 days for the people to go into the desert and to offer sacrifice to Yahweh. And Pharaoh said, "You're lazy. You just want a day off. Right, you've got to go back to work and you've got to work harder. You've got to supply your own straw. We're not going to give you straw any longer. Supply your own straw, but keep up the tally of the bricks." This is a sun-dried mud brick of the time of the Exodus, and you can quite clearly see fragments of straw used for bonding the clay. It's quite possible that this brick was made by an Israelite slave under the lash of the overseer's whips. But if it wasn't, it's certainly just what they would have looked like. In the desert, Moses went up into the mountain and God gave him the pattern of the tabernacle, a way of relating to the living God. And all the features of the tabernacle are an expression of the way we relate to God. Now, one of the features of the tabernacle was the bronze laver, where the priests, which stood between the altar of sacrifice and the curtain of the tabernacle, and before they went into the tabernacle, the priests had to wash their hands and their feet at the bronze laver. And the bronze laver was to be made from the mirrors of the ladies. This is a bronze mirror from the time of Moses, 1300 BC, which has been polished so that you can see your face in it. We tried to get a lady to pose with a reflection, but unfortunately the glass case stopped her getting close enough. But this is from the time, roughly the time of Moses, and would have been one of the mirrors that went to make the laver. On the night of the Exodus, the Egyptians, after the plagues, were so pleased to see the Israelites go, they showered them with gifts. And amongst the gifts, the ladies would have said, "Here you are, you take my mirror." And so these came to be made into the tabernacle. I like to think of an Egyptian middle-class lady putting on her eyeshadow, which was very fashionable at the time, and then going for coffee to the next door neighbour and saying, "How are you getting on with your Israelite slaves? Isn't this Moses a pest? Since Moses came on the scene, we can't do a thing with the slaves. They're so cheeky. Don't know what we're going to do." And while she's chatting to the neighbours, her kids are playing with mum's cosmetics and doing their faces up in mum's mirror. Anyway, as that may be, this is a souvenir of the Exodus, the time of the Exodus, and the making of the tabernacle. Joshua led the people into the land and conquered city after city. This jar is a great storage jar from Hatzor, and it is actually dated about the time of Joshua. Hatzor was 20 times the size of David's Jerusalem. The scholars admitted that there might have been a migration of nomads out of Egypt into Palestine, but anything on the scale of Joshua, as in the Bible, absolutely incredible. But Hatzor, 20 times the size of Jerusalem. It was excavated by Yigael Yardine, and in his records he actually says how he went down through the layers of Hatzor with the Bible in one hand and a spade in the other. Each layer that he uncovered in Hatzor, he could relate to the Bible. When Israel was being oppressed by the Arameans in Damascus, the houses were poor. When Israel was free and prosperous, the houses and the artefacts were much more luxurious. And he came down to a layer where everywhere they dug, there were ashes, charred remains. Clearly, Hatzor at one time had been destroyed by fire. The book of Joshua says that Hatzor was the only city that Joshua destroyed by fire. Yardine found a sanctuary, and in the sanctuary he found an altar that had a stone altar that had just a corner knocked off. He found a statue of a god or a worshipper with the head knocked off, the head lying close by. There was only one culture that would have conquered Hatzor and left the sacred objects where they were. The fashion of the time, if you conquered a city, you carried its gods off as trophies. You didn't leave them where they were. The only people who would have done that were the Israelites. Hatzor, 20 times the size of David's Jerusalem, destroyed by fire, just as in the book of Joshua, and with this sanctuary defiled but left in situ, evidence of the Israelites. And a city that size wasn't conquered by wandering nomads with a few goats. This storage jar is from that time, a smashed storage jar that's been restored from the time of Joshua. And oh, what it must have been like. A slave girl so worried about what's happening to her boyfriend out with Jabin's army, she comes down to this storage jar to get out the rations for the day, the barley for the day, and she hears a scream from upstairs. A messenger has just come in to say that Jabin's been defeated, the army's been defeated, and the Israelites are marching on the city. This jar, a souvenir of the conquest by Joshua. Joshua led the people into the promised land, and archaeology has revealed quite a lot about the kind of people into which Joshua led the Israelites. Most important local inhabitants were the Canaanites. Canaanites, one of the most advanced civilizations. They were wonderful builders. It's very interesting to see Canaanite building alongside Israelite building. The Canaanites came in to build the temple and Solomon's palaces, and also Ahab's palace in Samaria. When the Canaanites built, the stones were beautifully cut, some say accurate to 1/100th of an inch. The stones absolutely exactly rectangle, and they fitted in, no need for mortar, headers and stretchers, some of them beautifully chamfered. When the palaces need repairing, the Israelites had to do their best, And to see the rough Israelite stones alongside the Canaanite stones is very illuminating. The Israelites must have felt so inferior under the superior architecture of the Canaanites. The Canaanites were also very much into artistic and luxury goods. They prolific producers of ornamental ivory. This was recovered from the bottom of a well at Nineveh, part of perhaps the back of a chair, and it shows a man being savaged by a lioness. Lots of gold leaf about, but the background of lilies, the actual flower is a semi-precious stone, red semi-precious stone, against background of blue semi-precious stones, lapis lazuli. These luxury ivory goods were produced great quantities by the Canaanites. Unfortunately, it was very bad for elephants. Here is a picture of elephants from the Black Obelisk. Elephants were in Palestine, apparently. There's a record in the tomb of an Egyptian army officer. He records how he went on an elephant hunt with the Pharaoh. The chief Canaanite gods were El and Baal. El was a very distant figure, usually represented by a pair of horns, also inherited often by his son Baal. Baal was the god with whom people had the most to do. Baal wasn't a name, it's a title. It just means Lord or Master. And sometimes, quite legitimately, it's used for the name of God. It's used to describe God as Lord. Baal simply meant Master or Lord. And these are some bronze figures of Baal. The pottery included emblems for Baal. This is a double-headed axe, Baal's weapon, and rain, for Baal was the god of fertility. Baal was both the god of war and the god of fertility. In the Middle East, there isn't much rain. It just comes very brief periods in the year, the early rain and the latter rain. But when it rains, you don't just turn your collar up and carry on with what you were doing. When it rains, thunder and lightning, rain absolutely crashes down, and you just give up everything, seek shelter until it's gone over. But when the rain's gone past, the whole countryside comes to life. Anemones, flowers, and the crops all spring to life. And so Baal was the god of rain and thus the god of fertility, but with the thunder and lightning and the storm, that was a picture of warfare. So Baal was both the god of fertility, the god of rain, and the god of war. And most of the images of Baal, he has a club of thunder in one hand and flashes of lightning in the other hand. Here's an impression of a priest burning incense to Baal. He's wearing a warrior's helmet, a soldier's bronze helmet, conical, which meant the arrows would glance off it. And in one hand, his left hand here holding a club of thunder, and in his right hand, flashes of lightning. These are pictures of Baal's wife, Ashtoreth, Ishtar, Astarte, various names, various regions. Ishtar in Mesopotamia and Ashtoreth in the Old Testament, she gave her name to astronomy. Ishtar, Ashtoreth, astronomy, astrology, and I wonder if you noticed that the word disaster means a bad star. If you have a disaster, it's because you've had a bad star. Here is Ashtoreth as a temple prostitute looking out of the window, inviting customers to come in. She's wearing a prostitute's headdress, and in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 3, Jeremiah speaks of Jerusalem as having a harlot's forehead. The religion was based on fertility and upon sexual rites. For instance, at a marriage, the bride had to have intercourse with a priest in the temple before she had intercourse with her bridegroom. And the result was that the firstborn child wouldn't know whether it was Baal's child or the husband's child. Every firstborn child was burnt for Baal. Carthage was a principal Canaanite colony, and at Carthage thousands of jars were recovered containing the burnt remains of children between the ages of 2 and 10. This casual attitude to sex resulted in this terrible treatment of children. And it has something to say to us today, where sex is often treated casually, but we're quite okay with killing unborn children, the terrible practice of abortion going hand in hand with a casual attitude to sex. This is a household god, Ashtoreth, holding her breasts, giving milk to her worshippers. It's about 6 inches high, the original, and very popular amongst women in childbirth, and it was a handy size for a woman to hold tightly while she was giving birth. The great message of this particular one is that it was found in the grave of a Bethlehem woman about the time of Jeremiah, showing what a grip the pagan worship had on the Jewish people in the time of the prophets. Also amongst the people that were in the land were the Philistines. And here are some souvenirs of the Philistines. They had a peculiar headdress, something like a Red Indian's headdress. The sword gave the Philistines supremacy in the time of the judges. Amos tells us that the Philistines came from Caphtor, which we know as Crete. The civilization there was very advanced in metallurgy. They were able to mass produce bronze, very important for making armor and weapons. They were even able to make steel out of iron. They had a way of hammering iron until it turned carbonized into steel. This great two-handed slashing sword was what the Israelites had to face right through the time of Judges, quite a fearsome weapon. When David came to the throne, the area was in something of a political vacuum. The Hittites, the Egyptians, and the Mesopotamian powers were all in a very weak state. And in that power vacuum, David was able to build his empire. First of all, the Philistines objected when David was made king, and they came and tried to do away with David. But God blessed his armies, and twice David routed the Philistines. This gave the Israelite army confidence and experience, and David conquered, first of all, the Sinai Peninsula and the mines, very important mines in Sinai, and also the seaports of Ezion-Geber and Elath, opening up the sea routes to the south. And then he conquered to the north, and further to the north he entered into treaties with various nations. And so the promise made to Abraham, to Moses, to Joshua was at last fulfilled. And the people of God possessed the land from the river Euphrates down to the river of Egypt. But Solomon, you can see how from this area the message of the one true God could have gone out like spokes of a wheel down into Africa, into the Arabian Peninsula, up into Europe, to Mesopotamia. It could have spread out from the centre of Palestine. But Solomon spoilt it all. He married an Egyptian princess, married other pagan wives, and brought in their religion right into the temple at Jerusalem. A revolution was underway in Israel, and Jeroboam tried to overthrow Solomon. Solomon crushed the rebellion, and Jeroboam fled into Egypt, where he was sheltered by a pharaoh called Sheshonk, known to us in the Bible as Shishak. Quite a prominent figure in the Bible. This is one of a pair of solid gold bracelets, and they are inscribed to the effect that they were presented by Shishak to the crown prince, his son, the crown prince. The Bible tells us how Shishak invaded Palestine and plundered Jerusalem and took away much of the gold from Solomon's temple. One of the museum staff has suggested that what could be more likely than having successfully returned from that campaign with cartloads of gold, than that Pharaoh Shishak should have made these bracelets out of gold from Solomon's temple, presented them to his son. Whether or not that's true or not, of course, we don't know. But this pair of bracelets, one thing we can be sure of, that they were actually handled by this Pharaoh we read about in the Bible, Pharaoh Shishak, who sheltered Jeroboam.